The birds are still in here rooting around looking for stuff, but there's nothing for them to kick around to cover my slugs. And it's open, so the birds are coming down. Anything. So in this case, with this setup, the birds are actually helping me instead of being a problem. They're coming down, they're looking around. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and today I'm going to speak to a comment I get very often, and that is the general comment that my Ruth Stout garden is full of slugs and snails. So for those that are new to that concept, what's a Ruth Stout garden? A Ruth Stout garden is, a lot of people call it some people call it a back to Eden garden, some people call it a heavy mulch garden, some people call it a permaculture garden. There's lots of different terms for it, and I don't want to get into those finer details, but suffice it to say, any garden where instead of having the soil bare, you have the soil covered with some sort of decaying plant matter, whether that's hay or leaves or just whatever you can get your hands on. And that's kind of how my garden works. So people see me gardening and they see good results, and they say, I switched my garden to a Ruth Stout garden, and now I've got all these slugs and snails and flea beetles and stuff. And you know, what do I do, sort of thing, right? So, you know, I think first off, it's worth mentioning, it's worth discussing that, you know, when you have all of your soil covered in some sort of plant matter all the time, it does make an ideal environment for slugs and snails and flea beetles, right? Because it allows them to hide from, you know, birds and other kinds of predators. They like the environment. Also, you know, slugs and snails, aside from attacking your tender young plants and various varieties of plants all the time, they also like rotting plant matter. They do a lot of processing of that. They may be just as important as worms in terms of breaking it down. They eat that. You know, I have many different types of slugs and snails in my garden, different varieties, and some of them are just working on that decaying plant matter, doing my composting for me. So they're beneficial in a sense, right? But the problem arises when they attack your plants. And I got some of that going on right now. I'm going to show you some examples of that as we go along here. So I thought I'd speak to that and give you, you know, a kind of way of seeing that problem and seeing the solutions. Now, step one, and I did this. The first thing you do, because you want to have this organic garden, is you go on the internet and you type organic, chemical-free solution for slugs and snails. You do some sort of search like that on Google, and you'll find some article where the person's saying, you know, put coffee around it, put ashes around the bottom of the plant, put crushed up eggshells around the soil, around the bottom of the plant, put diatomaceous earth on the ground, you know, things like that, right? Those are all the common things. And I'm telling you, I tried all of those things for I mean, a good portion of my plants, the slugs just leave them alone anyway. I'll talk about that as we go along too. But there's certain kinds of plants that tend to get attacked kind of mercilessly by them. And those are the plants in the brassica family, you know, kale, cauliflower, you know, things of that nature. And the other main thing that I find gets attacked by them is baby squash, baby cucumbers, baby, you know, things in that family, right? Baby melons, you know, that sort of stuff, right? So those plants, sorry, the flies are kind of bad right now. So those things tend to get attacked, and I've tried all of those approaches, and I just gave up at some point and tried to find a product, a pesticide that, at least in my books, was acceptable to use for that sort of thing. Something that's, you know, has a chemical composition of things I recognize and that I understand will break down into compounds, into you know, molecular compounds or whatever, will break down into stuff that's kind of, you know, exists in nature anyway. It's not really a problem. So that's what I do. So what do I use? I use, and I mean, in full disclosure, my podcast used to be sponsored by a company that makes some of these products. They don't sponsor me anymore. But I mean, I guess to speak to that, I sought them out. They didn't seek me out, right? when I was trying to solve my pest problem, I used some of their products and I found that they worked, and I did a bit of reading on their products and I was totally comfortable using them in my garden. I don't use much of them at all anyway. In fact, I think half the reason they might have dropped me as a sponsor is I did so many videos talking about how little of the product you need to use and how you only need to use it for a little while, right? So I don't think I was doing a really good job pushing the products and saying that my goal was not to need any of those things at all anyway. Anyway, they don't sponsor me anymore, but I phoned them. Right, I used their stuff. I bought it at a hardware store. This stuff works great. And I phoned them and I said, hey, how about you give me some money? And I'll say, brought to you by, at the beginning of my podcast. So they agreed to that. And then after a couple of years, they said, we think we're done with you. Yes, that's life in the big city, right? So, and I didn't get much. I certainly didn't get enough money to compromise my integrity. Believe me. I just get enough to cover the costs of the web hosting and some stuff like that, right? None of that really went into my pocket. Anyway, just wanted to speak to that. What do I use? For slugs and snails, I use a pellet slug bait that the main ingredient is, iron, I think it's called iron sulfate. So it's basically like an iron pill, right? To oversimplify, you can look it up. I'll put the actual name up on the screen. But I mean, it's like an iron pill that's got a bit of a coating on it with stuff that smells good to a slug or a snail, right? And they eat it, and they get an overdose of iron. They completely lose their appetite, and they just crawl off somewhere and die. The other point is that you only use a little bit. You use enough. Most plants, once they get to a certain size, you don't need to use that stuff. It's not like you're applying it all season long. If you're doing that, you're just wasting money and you're wasting time and you're putting stuff out there that doesn't need to be put out there. Most plants, once they reach a certain height, their stems get thick enough. And, if slugs attack anything, they're going to attack the lower leaves. Same with flea beetles. They're most dangerous, flea beetles, when the plants have those first two leaves come out. They attack those really mercilessly. Those first two leaves are very tender. And they'll attack those and really weaken the plant. So that's when you have to be, when the plant's 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches high, that's when you have to really worry about flea beetles. Once it gets a bit bigger than that, you don't have to worry about them at all. They're around, but they don't really do anything to the plant, at least in my experience here in this place, right? I don't use, so there's a spray I use when they're really small. It's basically insecticidal soap with pyrethrin. It's basically soap with an extract from the root of a chrysanthemum. Simplest way to put it. But if you look at the ingredients, it's a bunch of chemicals, but everything is chemicals. I'm chemicals, you're chemicals, water's a chemical, right? So the chemicals are not the issue, right? It's toxicity, right? How toxic is the chemical? And for some chemicals, really, it's really not it's not the poison, it's the dosage. How much of it, right? So anyway, the pyrethrin-based insecticide, you just mix it with water and spray it on. It breaks down fairly quickly anyway, like you spray it on your plant and, it's going to sort of wipe out everything that's around. And then after about 24 hours, it's really not doing anything anymore. So I use a pyrethrin-based insecticidal soap for flea beetles. For aphids, unless it's an incredible problem, I might intervene. But I tend to let aphids sort themselves out. The ladybugs and things like that tend to show up and deal with it. I really don't have an aphid problem anywhere in my garden. Sometimes I get tent caterpillars in my apple trees, but even that I don't really get that much of a problem. I think what you're going to find over time in your permaculture, Ruth Stout, back to Eden, whatever you call it, garden, is that sure, you're creating an environment that a lot of pests like, but because you're building up a pest population, your predator population is going to start setting up shop, and living. The predators are going to be drawn to your garden, and you're going to have more and more of them, right? I mean, there's not a lot around right now because the birds tend to scatter when I show up, but every time I walk into this garden, there's finches and robins. Usually that's the two things I see here, and they take off, right? Otherwise, they're here basically from dawn to dusk, poking around the ground. They're not bothering my plants. They're basically searching for things to eat. And sure, they take the odd worm, but you know, I think they're looking, especially this time of year, spring, they've got, you know, babies, or they're trying to fatten themselves up or whatever. You know, they want the high-end meal, right? They want the meat. So they're going for the slugs and the snails and different sort of bugs and stuff like that, because that's just a good meal. And more and more of them are finding this is a good place to be. Last year in particular, for my kale, there's another pest that tends to show up later in the summer called whitefly. I think that's the name of it. I always get the name wrong, but it's a little white butterfly that flies around, lays an eggs on your brassicas, you know, your broccoli, your cauliflower, your kale, stuff like that. And then those eggs become these little unbelievably well camouflaged caterpillars that just destroy your plant, no matter how big it is. They really go at it. And my first couple years gardening here, first year I didn't have any problems at all. Second year I had a bit of a whitefly problem. And then the year after that and the year after that, it was unbelievably bad. And so I discovered this stuff called BTK. I can't remember the name of it, but I'll put it up on the screen. It's a bacteria. And it's a naturally occurring bacteria that naturally exists in the soil. And it's basically deadly to caterpillars. So if they eat it, normally caterpillars aren't eating dirt, right? They're eating leaves. If they eat it, it sort of destroys their stomach. So you're just spraying some of that on your plant, and you know, they eat the foliage at night usually. So it's good to spray it on at sunset. You spray it on at sunset, and I've done videos on this. If you just type maritime gardening BTK, you'll find them, before and after videos and stuff like that. You spray it on at sunset, they come out, and in the dark, when the birds aren't around, they start chewing on your leaves, they get some of that in their belly, and that's the end of them. A few hours of sunlight, you know, basically like a one-day period of sunlight completely destroys the BTK. As far as I understand it, it's not harmful to human beings anyway, but even if it was, after, you know, 7 hours of sunlight or something like that, it's basically not BTK anymore, it's something else, right? It breaks down, so it can't survive that, right? So that's the other reason to do it at sunset, because if you did it in the afternoon, it really wouldn't be effective by sunset, right? Anyway, I had to use that for a number of years to just be able to get a yield out of my garden. Otherwise, I wouldn't get anything. They just chew the plants down to almost nothing. And you know, there's a lot of gurus out there saying, well, if you've got this in your soil, if you've got that in your soil, if you've got chelates, and your plants will just be naturally pest-proof. I've never seen any evidence of that. I really think that's, I could be wrong, but I think that's hogwash. I think certain kinds of pests, you know, they like eating your plants because your plants taste good to them. You know, and if your plants are healthy, they're going to taste good and they're going to like them, especially when they're really young and vulnerable. Sure, when the plants are mature and big, I don't really understand why. That may be the case, that if your soil's healthy, the plant sort of maybe develops a sort of you know, toxin or something. Maybe the plant tastes different to those pests. I really don't know. But certainly when they're young and tender, I've never seen any of it. I've got really good soil here. I mean, you look at my garden tours in July and August, there's no doubt I've got good soil, right? Because I don't add anything to it, and I don't amend my soil. I just keep a mulch on it, and I get good results every year, and I hardly even have to water it all summer long. So, I mean, I've got a good garden, I've got good soil. But, you know, the plants that I have that are vulnerable to pests have never been pest-proof. Okay, to some extent, they're always getting attacked by them, with the brassicas being the most vulnerable. But a lot of the plants I have in the garden, they don't have a real problem. I have lettuce, spinach, to some extent, you know, peas for the most part, you know, carrots, onions, garlic, parsnips, right? Strawberries, like none of those things get bothered by pests anyway. It's only a handful of things. Young squash and cucumbers, young pumpkins. I mean, really young, when the first two leaves come out. the entire brassica family, turnip, broccoli, those things when they're young. And a couple other things when they're young under certain conditions, like if I've got, if some of the mulch, you push the mulch aside and you plant, let's say some carrots, and the birds are rooting around and they kick the mulch up and it covers the really young baby carrots. If those baby carrots are covered with mulch, something eats them every time. Some things don't mind being covered with a little bit of mulch and they just grow back through it. Like I find parsnips, if the mulch sort of blows back on them, right? You're sowing in a mulched bed. So you push the mulch aside, you plant your parsnips, and all of a sudden the mulch starts getting blown back in or kicked back in by birds or whatever. For whatever reason, pests don't seem to attack the parsnips when they have a couple leaves over them. The parsnip just keeps growing and it finds its way around the leaf and everything's fine. But carrots for sure will just disappear overnight if they're covered. So, I'll show you some examples of how I dealt with that. But I think it's enough prattling. It's time to go around the garden and show you what I'm talking about. All right, so here's a bed where I've planted some cucumbers. I did a video on planting these just a few weeks ago, and they came up, but there's one there, I think. Maybe not. They came up, but at least 50% of them have just disappeared. They were taken out by slugs and snails, slugs and or snails. They're just not here anymore. Look, there's what's left of one of them right there. Yeah. So I have to replant, right? I mean, I planted these a week ago and most of them are gone. There's one here. One of the leaves is missing. Here I've got a full one. So I just got to replant. But if I don't put some of this slug bait down, they'll all be gone. And I mean, you can use diatomaceous earth, and I have it, and I've done experiments with it. The problem with diatomaceous earth is that every time you water your garden, you have to replace it. And when you've got seedlings, you have to water them. I mean, at least I've got this covered in a dome, so it's not going to get rained on. But yeah, it's a bit of a pain. Whereas these, they'll basically survive a couple waterings and just sort of persist and continue to do their thing. I'm not worried about birds eating these and that sort of stuff because I'm going to close this and they can't get in here. On top of that, the kinds of birds that are drawn to my garden, they're not looking for these little pellets which have a cereal smell. They're looking for bugs, right? They're looking for things to feed their babies. So, I mean, these are all things you have to just square with your own conscience. Having tried every option out there, this is the way I deal with it. But for your squash and your cucumbers, you'll only need this stuff until they put out like their second or third leaves. Once they put out their second or third set of leaves, the stem of those plants, all of them become spiny. It has a sort of, it might seem like a fur to you or me, but to a slug it's like spikes, I guess, because once they get maybe 2-3 inches high and get the second and third set of leaves, they're completely slug-proof and snail-proof in my experience. They really don't bother them at all, and I don't need to use any of that stuff, right? So I only use it for a short amount of time when they're small. The same thing's the case with my kale and beans and all that sort of stuff. When beans are first emerging from the soil and those 2 leaves come out, they're very susceptible to slugs and snails. So I use a little bit of this stuff, or you just replant. You can just keep replanting, and eventually, there's safety in numbers, right? That's another strategy. I could have planted, twice as many cucumbers here. Maybe I should have, right? Another thing is the further you move the mulch back, from where you've got your stuff planted, the more dangerous ground the slug has to travel over to get to where the plant is. Right now, none of this matters when you've got a dome because the slugs are completely protected from things overhead. So, let me show you another garden. This one right here, actually, the adjacent garden. So this is a bed where I had carrots growing, and I sowed them very early in April, and they were doing pretty good. And then I hadn't removed the mulch from this bed. I just had, I basically, like this bed I just showed you, I pushed the mulch aside, made a row, and planted the carrots in the row. And I had lots of carrots growing, and then the birds started showing up, and they were kicking all that mulch over. The little tiny seedling carrots were getting covered with, leaves and stuff like that, and they were attacked. And I was really busy, and I just wasn't out here every day. And within a couple nights, something like 40% of my carrots just disappeared, maybe even more than that. So I sort of engineered the entire garden. So I took the mulch off, and I replaced it with a different mulch, right? So I've got this paper here. So this is still a mulch, right? The soil is covered, and there's still rotting plant matter underneath this. But now there's nothing for the birds to kick around. The birds are still in here rooting around looking for stuff, but there's nothing for them to kick around to cover my slugs. And it's open, so the birds are coming down. So in this case, with this setup, the birds are actually helping me instead of being a problem. They're coming down, they're looking around. Any slug or snail they see, they're going to kill it, they're going to eat it, right? And there's nothing for them to kick up and cover my plants with to make them vulnerable to slugs or snails. So by just doing this, I've turned the bird from a problem into an ally, right? And I don't need to use any slug bait here, or snail bait or whatever. I don't use anything, I just leave it open like this. And I should have a nice carrot garden here in a few weeks, right? And then eventually, once the carrots are maybe like, a hand span high, I'll remove these boards, and I'll cover all this paper with, grass clippings, various types of mulches. So I'll put a mulch back, because the foliage will be above that, and there'll be no issues. Once the carrots are a certain size, they're sort of, at least in my experience, slug and snail proof, where I am anyway. Here's a bed where I've got some spinach and some kale and different kinds of lettuce growing. These lettuce were just moved from another garden, that's why they look a little bit punch drunk. But anyway, these kale, when they were really little, there was a row of kale here, they were being attacked by slugs. And I just put the slug bait down, and or slugs, or I don't know what was in here, slugs or snails or something. They weren't around when I was around. So I just put a bit of that slug bait down. This was months ago, and problem solved. And now they're this size, I'm not using anything. I haven't used anything for weeks and weeks and weeks, right? Because I said once they're a certain size, they're okay. For kale, and there's different varieties of kale. Some are more, sort of pest-like some more than others, probably just because of the way they taste. This is winter boar kale. I find it pretty good in terms of slugs and snails not liking it, flea beetles and stuff like that. But when it's young, absolutely. I can see some slug damage right here. Here's a leaf. It's been, here, I'll show you. Right, it's been attacked, but it's one of the lower leaves. And that's the thing about a lot of slugs and snails. They attack lower leaves. They won't attack the upper leaves. So the leaves that are getting the most sun and doing the most growing and gathering the most energy, they're the most safe. The slugs will they do come around, they'll sort of hide underneath. And I mean, even a little bit of damage, it's not a problem. You're not selling your produce at a supermarket or a farmer's market, so your foliage can be imperfect. So even if you get a little bit of that problem, it's really not a problem. Anyway, this is the size, where, I just don't use anything. And for anything I'm using those sort of products on, I just monitor, and as soon as the problem seems to go away, I stop using it. I don't want to be the solution to my slugs, snails, and other pests. I want birds, other insects, snakes, right, toads. I want all of those things to be the solution to my problem. So I want the pests in my garden because they'll draw in the solution to the pests so that I don't have to be the solution. All right, so I hope I covered that well. A little bit of a rambling video there, but this is an issue I get a lot of comments on, and people are concerned about it. I know there's a a guy named Charles Dowding that has a different approach, and sure, watch his channel, do what he does. I find my approach easier. It's less labor intensive than what he does. That's the simplest way I can. Someone's going to say, Charles Dowding, he does this, he does that. Great, do what he does. I find my approach is easier. So anyway, I'll leave that where it is. So yeah, slugs and snails and these kinds of pests, for a good portion of the plants in my garden, they're not a problem at all. And for the ones that are a problem, they're a temporary problem for us only when they're young and sort of vulnerable, and then are not a problem after that. Oh, I forgot to finish up talking about the caterpillars and the BTK. I had to use BTK for a couple years, but last summer I saw the coolest thing. I was sitting right here having a beer, and I had a broccoli plant growing right over there. And I noticed a wasp go by. I mean, you're kind of keenly aware of wasps when they're around because you don't want to get stung. So I saw a wasp go by and I saw it land on my broccoli plant. And it's not like it had a flower with nectar. It wasn't in bloom in any way. So I thought, that's interesting. What's that broccoli plant? What's that wasp doing on my broccoli plant? And then I saw it fly away and it looked like it was carrying something. And then another minute went by and I saw another wasp go right to that broccoli plant. And after a few seconds, it was flying away and it looked like it was carrying something. So then I moved and got really close to it and just watched. And there was juvenile, those from the little white butterfly, juvenile caterpillars, very, very small, like the size of a maggot, really, on that plant. And the wasps were coming and harvesting them from the plant. If you look at my garden tours last summer, I had nice, big, beautiful kale plants and broccolini, I think it's called, all over the place in my garden. I didn't use any BTK at all, right? So it took a number of years for those pest killers, right, to show up and really set up shop in my garden. And hopefully the same thing will be this year, where I've finally reached that balance. And what I'm hoping is that over time with the snails and slugs, that'll happen too. It hasn't happened yet. I still have, a period of time, really kind of like May, where it can be an issue. But you got to think, if you've got an overabundance of a thing something eats, and the thing that's doing the eating is around, right? If I went downtown New York City and just brought a bunch of steak out and started barbecuing it, people would show up, especially if it was free steak, right? It's the same thing. You're basically starting a big barbecue, and over time, the things that prey on those insects are going to realize this is the best place to find that meal, and they're going to show up. So the wasp was a sign of seeing it. Seeing an increasing number of finches in my garden, I think, and different kinds of birds is evidence of it. Seeing more and more toads in my garden and garter snakes is evidence of that sort of thing happening. So yeah. So yeah, you do have pests in a Ruth Stout garden, and they're part of the magic. And if you're patient over time, things will balance out to some extent. There are things you can do to sort of intervene if you're at risk of losing your yield, whatever you're trying to grow for food. You don't want to have it, while you're waiting for those beneficial predators to show up. You don't want to, lose an entire year's harvest. So there's things you can do to intervene. They can be as benign as you doing the actual picking off of the pests. That would be impossible. I would be out here 24/7 in this garden doing that. And I know there's people that always say, I just pick them off. I prefer to let wasps pick my stuff off, right? That's my preference, right? And, if wasps aren't picking it off, I prefer to just blast it with something that kills everything. And, as little as possible, right? Just enough to knock the pests back. I still want the pests around, but just enough to knock them back enough so that the plant can thrive a little bit and reach a sort of level of development, level of maturity where it can shrug off pest damage. So that's what I seem to do here. So I hope that made sense, and I hope I got that across in a way that useful, and there's some useful bits of information there. So if you like this video, please like, share, subscribe, click the little bell if you want to know when I make new videos. And until next time, get out there, get at it, get mulching, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.